Seventh time is the charm with iOS App Store. That's the theme for this week. Hello, you're watching the development vlog for Shokken, a restaurant waitlist management tool that is currently available on Google Play Store and soon to be made available on iOS App Store, and soon indeed. This is Bill from Shokken, and this is week 76 of development. The current status, as I just mentioned, Google has approved the distribution of the app a long time ago, probably a couple of weeks ago by now. However, the iOS approval process has taken considerably longer, and it's a really long time coming. And on the seventh attempt, they finally approved it. And most of the problems I've discussed over the last couple of weeks have been fairly easy to address with one sticky one that kept getting my app rejected. A couple of weeks ago, I made the product decision to include multiple different versions of different options of subscriptions. And there's the monthly subscription and quarterly subscription if the customer is interested in paying upfront to save a little bit of money per month. And these two options are fine. However, given the cost of the app and the cost of running the app on my back end, and the way that people might be using this waitlist feature. In other words, if you don't have a restaurant and if you still want a waitlist that might be working for over a weekend or just a couple of days, you don't want to pay, I want to make sure that the customers can use the app without having to pay an entire month worth of service up front. So I offered 1 and 3 day options for the customers to be able to pay for the service as opposed to, again, paying for the entire month. That was fine with Google Play Store. And they're like, oh, well, if you want to give us 15% cut on your app, we'd happily take it. So Google approved that, no problem. However, with iOS, there was some situation going on. So initially, when I read the app publish guidelines that Apple themselves published, they mentioned specifically that if you're doing an auto-renewing subscription, in other words, if you have a subscription on your phone and then it automatically renews every month, that is considered an auto-renewing subscription with Apple. If you do this type of subscription, you're not allowed to have the duration set shorter than a week. That sort of makes sense. It doesn't make sense to charge people once every day, let's say, right? Because it's auto-renewing. So that makes sense. In other words, my monthly and quarterly subscriptions are in that category, auto-renewing. It's fine. However, my 1 day and 3 days, because of the policy that I read, I could not make them auto-renewing. I made them non-auto-renewing subscriptions. This is where the problem was. So to be more specific, the guidelines that they published didn't really specify the minimum duration for non-renewing subscriptions. Remember, what I mentioned just now is that for auto-renewing, they have a minimum of 1 week, but for non-auto-renewing, there's no guidelines. And in the app guidelines that they publish, there's nothing. So one would reasonably interpret this as, oh, you can set any duration possible. And in fact, the tools that they have in their backend, their App Store Connect, you have to use their App Store Connect to manage and publish your app, right? That's the tool that they've developed to interface with their backend. In the App Store Connect, you could set up a non-auto-renewing subscription that's less than a week long. That's fine. So I set one up for 1 day and set one up for 3 days. And guess what? Apple didn't like it. The reviewer didn't like it. Now, after some research, I discovered that apparently because especially the initial review of any app is done manually. In other words, a human is going through every single aspect of your app before they allow you to publish on their platform. It's possible that the reviewer might have done something incorrectly, right? Like, the publishing guideline has it's a tome of several dozens of pages, and you can assume and expect that somebody who's charged with enforcing the guidelines might not be totally familiar with every single one of them. So, okay, maybe they made a mistake. And I drafted a response, be like, oh, yo, take a look at I shared with them the link. Take a look at this policy that you yourself, Apple, have published, where they said that, for auto-renewing has to be 1 week or longer. For everything else, it can be shorter. and they reject it with the same reason. It's the can response that they give you, right? Like, instead of giving you more information, the agent would just copy and paste the entire section and then just send it back to you. So in other words, the second rejection was not terribly helpful because they didn't tell me why. Like, I explained to them, in your policy, you said this is okay, and that's why I'm resubmitting this app to you. I believe your previous agent made a mistake. But in a new rejection, they just copied and pasted the exact same rejection reason to me without really explaining why my counter for the submission was inappropriate or not good. And so that wasn't terribly helpful. And after some back and forths and some other rejections for other reasons, I decided, okay, that's too much work. If you go to my previous week or the previous 2 weeks of the weekly updates, you'll discover I'm fed up. I don't want to have to deal with this. I mean, I got to get my users first before I start worrying about revenue. So I'm like, okay, let's axe all the subscriptions and only use the monthly. That's the easiest one to deal with. And product-wise, it might be the easier one to sort of get your customers to wrap their heads around it, right? So okay, let's axe all of the rest of them. So I decided to do that. Now, to be fair, Apple did give me a call at some point, and we discussed this problem. The agent on the phone, after having heard my explanation to them, double verified that this policy requires that I have a subscription, either auto-renewing or non-auto-renewing, to be longer than 1 week. I still believe this is a mistake, by the way, because again, for two reasons. Number one, their own policy doesn't say that. And number two, if this is against your policy, why have you made a tool that would allow people to do something that your policy doesn't allow, right? Again, their tool, their App Store Connect, allows you to create non-auto-renewing subscriptions that's shorter than 1 week. The crazy part is that this tool does enforce 1 week minimum for auto-renewing subscriptions. In other words, this tool cannot be used to create an auto-renewing subscription that's shorter than a week. So why is your tool enforcing exactly what your policy is saying, and yet your agents are telling me something that's completely different? That's besides the point. Okay, the agent did, and we did talk, and I suggested to the agent, okay, so if I really wanted to do this, could I convert those 1 to 3 day subscriptions from non-auto renewing to one-time payments, in-app purchases, IAP? In other words, like, if you play those mobile games, you can do a one-time top-up of your coins. These are considered one-time in-app purchases. And so, in other words, I can still do 1 to 3 days subscriptions, non-auto-renewing subscriptions, or the items to purchase. I would just be using a different classification of product in their backend. In other words, the policy, if you think about this, the policy doesn't make, excuse my language, it really doesn't make a lot of sense at all. They don't let you do 1 to 3 day non-auto-renewing subscriptions. By the way, if you think about it, a non-renewing subscription is not any materially different than an in-app purchase, right? It's just the terminology is different. So in other words, I can't do 1 to 3 days with this product type. However, I could do 1 and 3 days with in-app purchases. So in other words, I could still do what I want. I just need to call it differently. Anyways. So, the agent was like, yeah, you could do that. And if you did that, resubmit the app, we should be fine. I was like, okay, sure. But then I looked into it. The blast radius for converting from non-auto-renewing subscriptions to in-app purchases is actually pretty large. Multiple backends have to be touched. My database has to be touched. My revenue cap, which is the revenue management backend, has to be touched. App Store Connect definitely has to be touched. And then my app code has to be touched. There's a lot of things. That's too much effort. Let me just get rid of all of them, do the monthly, and then we'll worry about the different product types down the line, subscription types down the line. So I removed it from the app, submitted it, immediately received another rejection saying that, oh, hey, your 1 day, 3 day stuff, we can't find in your app binary. Then why you're submitting it to us? In other words, they their backend somehow still thinks I'm trying to get approved my 1 day and 3 day subscriptions. However, my binaries, because I deleted all of them, my app, right? The app, I deleted references of those subscriptions from my app. So they're like, well, you're telling us you want to do 1 to 3 days, and your app doesn't show 1 to 3 days. What's going on? So they rejected it. I was like, what? What? Because I didn't want to do it anymore, right? And then and their documentation on this thing is horrendous, by the way. I couldn't really find any way to help me resolve this problem. In the end, I had a long late night chat discussion with ChatGPT, who suggested that I make some changes in the App Store Connect. So instead of just simply removing them from my app and removing them from the submission, I would delist them. In other words, I would choose remove from sale. That there's a button you can click for the 1 day and 3 day products you created to remove them from sale. And the idea, hopefully, is that this removes from the app submission that you give to Apple. So I did that, submitted it. Immediately came back with the exact same problem. And the copy and paste response, not helpful. And so I was like, what do I have to do, right? I removed them from my submission. I delisted them from the App Store Connect in the backend, and I removed all the references from my app. And you're still claiming you're seeing them, and as a result, rejecting my app. And I can't include them in the app, because if I did, you're like, oh, you can't do 1 to 3 day non-renewable subscription, despite the fact that your policy says you could. What do I have to do? And then after, I think, another round or two of rejections, well, this is too much work. I'm just going to do the nuclear option. I'm going to remove my entire app application and then recreate a new submission to Apple. So the way it works is that in the App Store Connect, you can create a submission, and then you list everything that you want to, including that submission, including your app binary, plus all the in-app purchases and subscriptions, and all those things would have to be approved, by the way, individually. So I was like, okay, maybe their system's glitching, some stuff got stuck in this particular submission. So instead of trying to fix it, I removed the entire submission and I recreate a new one. I'm making sure I don't include those 1 day and 3 day stuff in it, right? The subscriptions, the non-renewable subscriptions. So I recreated the new submission for them, making sure that the bad stuff doesn't go in. I submitted it immediately, the exact same verbatim rejections. So in the end, I did I guess it's not nuclear bomb anymore, it's the hydrogen bomb situation, where I was like, okay, let me just remove, like, as opposed to delisting or removing from sale, completely remove those 1 day and 3 day non-auto renewing subscription entities that I created in App Store Connect a long time ago. Now, you might be wondering why I didn't do that in the first place, because there's considerable implications with regards to removing something permanently in App Store Connect. By the way, this is not just Apple. Google does the same thing. So if you create an item for sale, let's say a 1 day subscription, a 3 day subscription, in their backends, that you give it a name, you give it a description, and all the other information and details and whatnot. That ID gets locked up permanently. So even if you delete that particular subscription item or sale item, you can never ever take the name back. In other words, the name is permanently taken. So it's sort of like an email address name, but worse, right? Because email address, if the email account gets deleted after a certain period of time, the name gets released back into the pool, and you can use the same name again. But here, if the name is taken ever, you can never ever reuse it. So if I deleted it and later down the line I want to reuse it, I'd have to come up with a new name. The problem is, it's like, okay, there's an infinite number of ways of naming things. Why are you so sort of married to a particular name that you can't reuse again? The problem is that when I created those things, I did the best practice. I used a naming convention, right? With all those things, it's a good idea to just not randomly name things. So you give them a particular pattern such that in the future, when you're trying to search for some things, it will become easier. So I gave it a nice naming convention. So if I deleted this and this becomes unavailable and down the line I want to reuse this, I can't use the same naming convention again. The naming convention, I thought it was so good. So, but I think at that point I ran out of patience. Let me just nuke it, and then hopefully that I can fix it, and we wouldn't have to deal with this for a long time. And I think that was the right decision, because that was really the last reason that the app kept getting rejected. And after that, after I think 2 to 3 days, they were like, "Oh yeah, good, you're ready to go." So, seventh time I counted this 6 rejections, and the seventh time that was the initial approval. So the app is now ready to be published. And I think the lesson learned here is, of course, well, you use a lot of patience when you're dealing with stores. That's number one. Number two, uh, there are compromises that you will probably have to deal with. It's just the reality. And I could sit here all day long and try to sort this out with them, and eventually I might get my way. But I mean, I don't have all the time in the world. This needs to hit the market and start seeing some action. So that's the goal for next week. And next week, I think I like to talk about the new video making process, the marketing material making process that I seem to stumbled upon that seems to be working quite well now. And I'm on my way to make my very first promotional video. And if everything goes well, that's the update that I'll share with you next week. That's it for this week, and I'll see you next week.